My name is Lucinda Halcyon. I'm 38 years old, a mother of two, and until recently, I was the kind of woman people describe as steady. Not brilliant, not fiery, not unforgettable, just steady. I live in a quiet coastal city where people wave at each other in grocery store aisles and assume they know the full story by the way someone stands next to their spouse. For most of my adult life, I was the dependable one, the calm one, the one who didn't raise her voice at school meetings, who volunteered for the extra shift, who smoothed over tension at family gatherings with a polite smile and a practical solution. And because I was calm, people mistook me for passive. Because I was thoughtful, they assumed I was naive. Because I didn't argue in public, they believed I had nothing to say. When my marriage ended, the story about me was written quickly. It was simple, convenient, easy to repeat. He told our kids I abandoned the family. It's a sentence that travels fast. It fits neatly into conversations. It paints a clear villain, and I suppose I was an easy choice. I had already been cast in the quiet role, the one who absorbs tension rather than creates it. What no one expected, what he certainly didn't expect, was that I would never argue his version aloud. I didn't defend myself at family dinners. I didn't send emotional texts. I didn't post long explanations online. Instead, I waited, because the truth doesn't need volume. It needs timing. This isn't a story about revenge. There are no screaming confrontations, no dramatic courtroom outbursts, no cinematic takedowns. It's about something quieter than that. It's about documentation, patience, restraint, and the moment when my children became old enough to read for themselves. He told them I walked away, so I let them read the court transcript, and the truth hit harder than any story he invented. What unfolded after that wasn't chaos. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't a triumph. It was something far more powerful, clarity, the kind that rearranges a room without anyone moving a chair. In the next hour, I'm going to walk you through how I became invisible in my own home, how small dismissals turned into a narrative I didn't recognize, and how silence, when chosen carefully, can become the most decisive action of all. I won't dramatize it. I won't exaggerate it. I'll tell you exactly what happened, and how I learned that sometimes the strongest response isn't correction. It's evidence. Have you ever been quietly misrepresented and realized that defending yourself would only make the story louder, not truer? Before I became the woman who left, I was something much easier to overlook. In our house in Brighton, I was the one who remembered dentist appointments without reminders. The one who knew which child preferred their toast barely browned and which one needed 5 quiet minutes before speaking in the morning. I worked part-time at a small legal office near the marina. Just enough hours to contribute, not enough to be considered ambitious. To outsiders, that was the first definition of me. Lucinda works part-time. It was never said cruelly, just casually, as though that single fact explained everything about my value. At school events, I was the mother who brought neatly cut fruit instead of elaborate cupcakes. At neighborhood dinners, I listened more than I spoke. If a conversation drifted into politics or business strategy, my husband would lean forward slightly, not aggressively, just enough to occupy the space, and the circle would naturally turn toward him. He was articulate, quick, charming in a way that made people feel chosen when he focused on them. I was steady, and steadiness doesn't sparkle. At home, the pattern was similar. He handled big decisions. I handled everything that made those decisions possible. He would describe himself as the provider. I didn't correct him, not because it was untrue, he earned more, but because correction would have sounded petty, defensive. I had no interest in keeping score. The children saw him as decisive. They saw me as dependable. Dependable is invisible in the moment. If dinner appears on time every night, no one asks how. If uniforms are clean and pressed, it feels automatic. If permission slips are signed, it seems effortless. And if a woman doesn't demand recognition, people assume she doesn't need it. There were small social cues I noticed, but never commented on. When guests thanked him for hosting, though I had prepared everything. When relatives asked him about his house, I stood beside him holding the keys. When he retold family stories and adjusted them slightly, polishing his role, softening mine, he wasn't cruel, that's important to say. He didn't shout. He didn't insult me publicly. There were no obvious villains in our living room, just subtle rearrangements of credit, quiet edits of memory. Over time, those edits became narrative. At family gatherings, he would joke lightly. Lucinda couldn't handle my work hours. She prefers things simple. Everyone would laugh politely. I would smile. Simple. I had studied legal administration. I understood contracts better than most of our friends. I kept digital backups of everything from mortgage payments to maintenance receipts. I could tell you the interest rate history on our loan from memory. But because I didn't advertise competence, it was assumed I lacked it. Even the children absorbed it in small ways. When something broke, they called for him first. When something was lost, they called for me. He was the fixer. I was the finder. It's a subtle hierarchy, but a hierarchy nonetheless. And I allowed it. Not out of weakness, out of calculation. I believed peace was worth more than precision. I believed that harmony required someone to yield occasionally. I believed love didn't need documentation. What I didn't understand yet was how easily absence can be manufactured when someone else controls the microphone. In our home, I was reliable, organized, and calm. But in their perception, I was secondary. And secondary is the easiest position to erase. I didn't know then that the same traits that made me easy to overlook would one day make me impossible to contradict. Because when you're quiet long enough, people stop noticing what you're collecting. And I was collecting more than they realized. The first time I felt it, really felt it, wasn't loud. It was a Tuesday evening in early autumn. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the children were finishing homework at the kitchen table. I had just placed a folder on the counter, our updated household budget. Nothing dramatic, just numbers, projections, notes in the margins. He walked in from work, loosened his tie, glanced at the folder, and smiled in that distracted way people do when they want to acknowledge something without engaging with it. "What's that?" he asked. "I reorganized the budget," I said lightly. I noticed the utility increases and adjusted the projections for winter. He flipped it open for less than 3 seconds. "Love, you don't need to worry about that. I've got it." The words themselves were gentle, almost affectionate, but there was something underneath them, something dismissive disguised as reassurance. I remember standing there, dish towel in hand, and feeling a quiet shift in my chest. Not anger, not humiliation, just a small tightening. "I wasn't worried," I replied calmly. "I just thought it would help." He kissed my forehead, already moving toward the stairs. "It's sweet that you try." Sweet. I stood there after he left the room, the kitchen suddenly too quiet. Sweet is what you call a child's drawing. Sweet is what you say about a hobby that doesn't quite matter. Not strategic, not competent, sweet. The children hadn't reacted. They were used to our rhythms. But I noticed something subtle. Our eldest glanced up briefly, then looked back down, as if observing a cue. That night, after everyone went to bed, I reopened the folder. I reread my notes. The calculations were correct. The projections were precise. I had flagged a subscription he'd forgotten to cancel, one that had quietly renewed for months. He never mentioned the folder again. 2 weeks later, at dinner with friends, finances came up casually. Rising costs, mortgage rates, the usual. He leaned back confidently. "I handle all of that." Lucinda would go mad trying to track numbers. Everyone laughed, kindly, not cruelly. I smiled again, because correcting him in front of friends would have felt combative. And I was not a combative woman, but I remembered the Tuesday evening. I remembered the word sweet. That was the first small cut, not sharp enough to bleed, just enough to register. Over the next few months, the pattern repeated in different forms. If I offered an opinion about school schedules, he would respond with, "Let's not overcomplicate it." If I suggested we review the mortgage structure, he'd say, "I've already thought about it." The implication was consistent. He was the thinker. I was the supporter. And here's the part I rarely admit. I began to internalize it. Not fully, not consciously, but subtly. When you're told often enough that something is handled, you start stepping back from the table. I told myself it wasn't important. That division of roles was normal. That his confidence benefited the family. That my job was stability, not spotlight. But something else was forming beneath that rationalization. Awareness. Because even while I smiled, I started noticing tone, word choice, timing. I noticed how narratives are built not from dramatic lies, but from repeated simplifications. He wasn't rewriting history yet. He was editing the present. And edits, if unchallenged, become official versions. That Tuesday night wasn't an argument. It wasn't explosive. No one stormed out. No tears were shed. It was smaller than that. But small things, repeated over time, become structural, and structures are much harder to dismantle once they've settled into place. I didn't confront him. I didn't defend myself. But from that moment on, I started paying closer attention, not to prove him wrong, just to understand exactly how the story of me was being written. The unsettling thing about subtle disrespect is how easily it blends into routine. If someone shouts at you, you recognize the violation immediately. If someone insults you directly, there's a clean edge to push against. But when someone consistently minimizes you with a smile, it becomes difficult to name. After that first sweet comment, the pattern didn't escalate dramatically. It simply repeated. At school meetings, if I began answering a teacher's question about our son's reading progress, he would gently interject, "What Lucinda means is," and rephrase my answer in slightly more polished language, not contradicting me, just refining me. People nodded at him. I would nod too. At family gatherings, if conversation turned to future plans, he'd speak in terms of my career trajectory and what works for my schedule. My role would appear as a footnote. Lucinda's flexible. She manages the home side. As though it were a small administrative hobby. The first few times I told myself it was unintentional. He was confident. I was reserved. That dynamic can look uneven without being malicious. But repetition changes interpretation. One evening, our daughter asked if I would be at her school performance. Before I could answer, he responded from the other room, "Of course, Mum will. She's always free." Always free. The phrase landed quietly, but something inside me tightened again. I worked part-time, yes, but I worked. I coordinated schedules, met deadlines, and handled documentation for cases that required precision and confidentiality. Free was not the word. Still, I didn't correct him in front of her, because I didn't want her to feel tension. I didn't want to turn a simple question into a parental correction, so I absorbed it. That's how normalization happens, not through agreement, but through avoidance. Over time, I began editing myself before he could. If I had a thought about finances, I shortened it. If I had a suggestion about a long-term decision, I softened it. If I felt overlooked, I rationalized it. He doesn't mean it. It's not worth conflict. It's just his personality. And perhaps part of that was true. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't explosive. He wasn't a caricature of a controlling husband. He simply occupied more narrative space, and I allowed him to. There's a strange comfort in being underestimated. Expectations are lower. Pressure is lighter. You can move quietly. You can observe without scrutiny. But the cost is gradual erosion. I began noticing something even more concerning. Not in him, but in myself. When friends asked about my job, I downplayed it. It's just administrative. When relatives complimented his achievements, I amplified them. He works incredibly hard. When people praise me for holding everything together, I deflected. It's nothing special. I was participating in my own diminishment, not consciously, not resentfully, just habitually. And habits once formed become identity. The children mirrored what they saw. If there was a complicated question about a contract or an insurance document, they directed it toward him first, even though I was the one who understood those systems intimately. It wasn't deliberate disrespect from them. It was modeling. He spoke with certainty. I spoke with caution. Certainty sounds authoritative. Caution sounds unsure, even when it's thoughtful. The turning point wasn't a dramatic betrayal. It was a quiet realization one evening when I overheard him on the phone. "I carry most of it," he was saying casually. "Lucinda prefers a slower pace. It works for us. It works for us." Except I had never agreed to that description. In that moment, I understood something critical. Narratives don't require lies. They only require repetition. And his version of me, gentle, simple, unburdened by complexity, was becoming official. I could have interrupted that call. I could have confronted him afterward. Instead, I did something else. I started listening more carefully than ever before. Because if a story was being built about me, I needed to know its exact architecture. Not to argue with it, but to prepare for the day it would matter. There's a moment, subtle, almost invisible, when you realize you've been cast in a role you never auditioned for. It happened one Sunday afternoon while we were hosting his colleagues. The house smelled of rosemary and roasted vegetables. I had spent the morning preparing everything, cleaning, cooking, and setting the table with the good plates we rarely used. When they arrived, he greeted them at the door like a man welcoming guests into a home he single-handedly built. Come in, he said warmly. Lucinda's taken care of everything. Taking care of everything. It sounded complimentary, generous even. But as the evening unfolded, I noticed how the phrasing shaped the room. When someone asked about the recent rise in property taxes, he launched into a detailed explanation. I had researched the topic thoroughly just weeks before, partly for our own planning, but the conversation never turned toward me. Not because I was excluded, because I was expected not to enter. My role that evening, and increasingly in life, was atmospheric. I ensured comfort. I maintained flow. I refilled glasses before anyone asked. I anticipated needs before they were spoken. Invisible labor creates visible ease, and ease makes people comfortable enough not to question who sustains it. At one point, a colleague's wife asked me, "Do you ever get bored being at home so much?" I smiled the way I always did. "I keep busy." She nodded sympathetically, as if I were enduring something small and unambitious. The truth was more complex. I balanced employment with motherhood intentionally. I understood legal systems in ways most of the room did not. I managed our household logistics with precision. But complexity doesn't surface unless someone invites it. And no one was inviting it, because the role had already been assigned. He was the strategist. I was the stabilizer. He made decisions. I supported them. There's nothing inherently wrong with those dynamics, unless they become the only lens through which you're seen. That night, after everyone left and the children were asleep, I stood in the quiet kitchen again. The same kitchen where he had once called my financial planning sweet. He wrapped his arms around me from behind. "You're brilliant at this," he said. "You make everything run smoothly." I could have taken it as praise. But something had shifted in me. "Brilliant at what?" I asked gently. He laughed softly. "You know, hosting, keeping things together. You don't need to worry about the complicated parts." The complicated parts. I turned slightly to look at him. "What are the complicated parts?" I asked. He hesitated just long enough to reveal the assumption. Work, investments, long-term strategy, that sort of thing. And there it was, clearer than ever. He didn't see me as incapable. He saw me as unnecessary to complexity. The realization didn't spark anger. It sparked clarity. Roles are comfortable, for the person benefiting from them. Reliable, useful, invisible. That was the framework I had been placed inside. And I had cooperated with it for years because I believed cooperation preserved peace. But peace without recognition becomes erasure. I went to bed that night not upset, but aware. If I were to remain in this role, it would no longer be accidental. And if I ever chose to step outside of it, I would need more than emotion. I would need documentation. Because the moment a quiet woman challenges the narrative, the first response is always disbelief. I wasn't ready to challenge anything yet. But for the first time, I understood the shape of the box I was standing in. And once you see the walls clearly, you begin to measure the exits. The shift didn't come during an argument. It came on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. I was at work, seated at my small desk near the window that overlooked the marina. The tide was low, boats tilted slightly against their moorings, suspended between movement and stillness. I remember that detail because I felt oddly similar, anchored, but angled. A client had come in for a post-hearing document review. Nothing dramatic, just clarification of what had already been recorded in court. I printed the transcript, highlighted key statements, and walked him through the language line by line. He listened carefully. At one point he frowned and said, "I didn't realize it was written like that." "It's written exactly as it was said," I replied calmly. "The court records don't adjust for tone, only words." He grew quiet. Later, after he left, I remained seated, staring at the highlighted transcript still resting on my desk. The court records don't adjust for tone, only words. It struck me then how different documentation is from conversation. Conversations are fluid. They bend. They're retold with edits, with added emphasis, with omissions. Tone can imply what was never stated. Memory reshapes intention. But transcripts don't care about tone. They don't soften. They don't exaggerate. They don't protect anyone's pride. They simply record. That afternoon, I realized something about my own life. I had been living inside conversation. He had been narrating an inside conversation. And I had never considered the power of record, not because I anticipated conflict, but because I trusted my memory. I trusted mutual understanding. I trusted that shared experiences would be interpreted in good faith. And yet, slowly, subtly, our shared story was becoming asymmetrical. When I returned home that evening, the house felt the same. The children were arguing about screen time. He was in his office, door half closed, speaking animatedly on a call. Nothing dramatic had happened, but something inside me had settled. For the first time, I stopped trying to be perceived correctly. Instead, I started asking a different question. If one day, everything I said was dismissed, what evidence would remain? Not accusations, not emotional recounting. Evidence. I opened my laptop that night after everyone went to sleep. Not to spy. Not to invade privacy. Just to organize. I created folders. Mortgage statements. Utility payments. Insurance policies. Email correspondence about school schedules. Messages about shared decisions. Not because I believed I would need them, but because I suddenly understood something fundamental. Narratives can be rewritten. Records cannot. There was no confrontation that night, no icy silence, no shift in my tone the next morning. Externally, nothing changed. Internally, everything did. I stopped correcting him casually because the correction was reactive. Instead, I started observing with intention. When he described our financial structure to friends, I made a note of phrasing. When he referenced carrying most of it, I archived the context of shared expenses. When he mentioned my flexibility, I reviewed the hours I logged at work. Not obsessively, not angrily, clinically. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about understanding the difference between perception and proof. And once you understand that difference, you move differently. He didn't notice the shift. Why would he? I was still calm, still cooperative, still reliable. But silence, when it becomes conscious, feels different from silence born of avoidance. Before I had been quiet to maintain harmony. Now I was quiet to gather clarity. That Wednesday afternoon in the Marina office was the first time I recognized the distinction. I wasn't preparing for a battle. I was preparing for accuracy. And accuracy, I would eventually learn, is far more powerful than outrage. Because outrage can be dismissed. Documentation cannot. After that Wednesday, my silence changed texture. Before it had been instinctive. A reflex meant to smooth tension, to preserve comfort, to prevent escalation. I stayed quiet because I didn't want conflict to enter the room. Now I stayed quiet because I was observing the room. That distinction is subtle, but it alters everything. He continued as he always had. Confident in public, decisive in tone, casual in the way he summarized our lives to others. I carry the financial pressure. Lucinda prefers to focus on the children. She doesn't like complicated things. Each sentence taken alone sounded harmless, even complimentary. But repetition builds structure. And while he spoke, I listened differently. I stopped correcting minor inaccuracies. I stopped offering counterpoints in social settings. I stopped softening his exaggerations. Not because I agreed, because I was measuring. There's a power in letting someone fully express the narrative they believe is safe. The more certain someone feels, the more detailed they become. At home, my behavior shifted in ways that looked identical from the outside. I still managed schedules, still handled school communications, still ensured the house ran smoothly. But I began documenting everything. When we discussed shared expenses, I followed up with polite confirmation emails. Just to confirm, we agreed to split the insurance increase evenly. When he transferred funds, I saved transaction records in organized folders. When decisions were made about renovations or investments, I requested written summaries for clarity. He interpreted this as administrative thoroughness, an extension of my home management role. He even praised it once. "You're so organized. I'd lose track of everything without you." I smiled. He had no idea that organization in the right context becomes leverage. There was a calmness in me during those months that surprised even myself. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel resentful. I felt precise. It's difficult to explain how empowering precision can be. When you stop trying to be understood emotionally, you free yourself from the exhausting cycle of justification. I no longer needed him to acknowledge my competence. I simply needed to know it was recorded. The children didn't sense tension. If anything, I became steadier, less reactive, more deliberate. When our eldest repeated something he had said, "Dad handles the hard stuff," I didn't correct him sharply. I asked gently, "What do you think the hard stuff is?" He hesitated. "Work, money, big decisions." "And what do you think I handle?" I asked. He thought for a moment. "Everything else. Everything else." That phrase would have stung months earlier. Now, it clarified something essential. Everything else is infrastructure. Infrastructure is what holds buildings upright long after people stop admiring the facade. And infrastructure, when removed, reveals its importance immediately. He mistook my composure for agreement. He mistook my silence for limitation. He mistook my documentation for domestic efficiency. And the more secure he felt in that interpretation, the more confidently he expanded his version of events. Especially when we began experiencing tension privately. The arguments, when they eventually came, were still controlled, measured. No shouting, no slammed doors. But I noticed something new. When he described our conflicts later, to friends, to family, he positioned himself as patient, as burdened, as carrying more than he should. I didn't challenge those descriptions publicly, because challenging them verbally would have required competing narratives. And I had already decided I wasn't competing. I was recording. Silence is often perceived as weakness, but silence chosen deliberately is a strategy. I wasn't shrinking. I was consolidating. He thought I was becoming smaller in the story. In reality, I was stepping outside of it. And once you step outside a narrative, you begin to see how easily it can unravel, if only the right pages are turned. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. After silence became intentional, my life appeared unchanged. I still woke before everyone else, still packed lunches, still walked the children to school when my schedule allowed, still worked my shifts at the legal office with the same steady competence. But beneath that calm surface, something was unfolding with quiet discipline. I began learning more deliberately, not about him, about systems. In the office, I paid closer attention to how cases unraveled, not the explosive ones, but the subtle separations. The marriages that dissolved not because of scandal, but because of narrative drift. I watched how documentation shaped outcomes, how judges didn't respond to emotion nearly as much as they responded to timelines. Dates, transfers, correspondence, patterns. Patterns matter. At home, I reorganized our digital files under the guise of efficiency. I created shared cloud folders for convenience. I suggested password management for security. He agreed easily. Why wouldn't he? The organization benefited everyone. He never noticed that I was creating accessibility for myself. I requested copies of financial statements just in case. I reviewed mortgage agreements carefully. I ensured my name was properly documented on every shared asset. Not secretly, openly. The brilliance of preparation is that it doesn't require secrecy, only patience. I also began positioning myself professionally. At work, I asked for additional responsibilities. I volunteered to assist with complex filings. I familiarized myself with procedural nuances I hadn't needed before. My supervisor noticed. "You've been sharper lately," she commented one afternoon. I smiled slightly. "Just paying attention." At home, he interpreted my growing precision as helpfulness. "You're on top of everything," he said once, glancing at a neatly organized spreadsheet I had prepared for tax season. It wasn't praise that moved me. It was confirmation. He still saw me as logistical support, not strategic presence. And that miscalculation gave me room. There's something powerful about being underestimated when you're no longer trying to correct it. People speak freely around you. They disclose more. They assume you won't challenge them. They reveal their thinking without defensiveness. I began noticing how he framed disagreements in writing, the tone he used in emails when tensions surfaced, the subtle ways responsibility shifted in phrasing. "I assumed you'd handle that." "I didn't realize it was my responsibility." "You never mentioned concern." Each sentence seemed harmless alone. Together, they formed a pattern. And patterns, when laid side by side, tell a story that individual sentences cannot. The children, too, remained unaware of the quiet shift. I didn't involve them. I didn't hint at future possibilities. Their world stayed stable, predictable, safe. Because preparation is not about creating fear. It's about ensuring that if there are stability fractures, you are not scrambling in the rubble. Months passed like this. No explosive fights. No dramatic revelations. Just accumulation. Emails archived. Bank transfers recorded. Shared decisions time-stamped. Professional competence expanded. The most important preparation, however, wasn't logistical. It was emotional. I stopped seeking validation from him. That may sound small, but it was transformative. When he dismissed a suggestion, I didn't try harder to persuade him. When he simplified my role in conversation, I didn't feel the urge to interrupt. When he described himself as carrying the weight, I simply noted the phrasing. Because once you stop needing someone to see you accurately, You begin seeing them clearly, and clarity removes fear. He never noticed that I had stopped defending myself. He interpreted it as acceptance. He didn't realize it was Independence Day. By the time tension between us finally escalated into formal separation, I was not surprised. I was ready, not with anger, not with accusations, with records. And records don't shout. They wait. He thought the story of our marriage would be told in conversations, in sympathetic retellings over coffee, in simplified summaries to the children. What he never noticed was that while he was narrating, I was assembling, carefully, methodically. And when the moment came, I wouldn't need to argue. I would only need to open a folder. The day I understood the full weight of what I had gathered wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp, no triumphant realization, no cinematic swell of music in the background. It was quiet. I was seated at the dining table long after the children had gone to bed. The house was still, the kind of stillness that hums faintly in the walls. My laptop screen cast a pale glow across stacks of neatly labeled folders. Separation had already begun by then. Not legally finalized, but emotionally undeniable. Conversations had turned colder. Politeness had replaced partnership. We spoke about logistics, pickup times, bill splits, schedules. He had begun telling people gently, carefully, that I was pulling away, that I needed space, that I was overwhelmed. The phrasing was deliberate. Overwhelmed sounds fragile. Pulling away sounds impulsive. Needing space sounds unstable. And then one evening, through a relative who meant no harm, I heard the simplified version. Lucinda left. Just like that. No timeline, no context, no nuance. Lucinda left. I didn't confront him. I didn't call anyone to correct it. I went home. I opened my folders. For the first time, I reviewed everything not as scattered documentation, but as a continuous narrative. Emails discussing his extended absences. Messages where I requested counseling. Financial records showing shared contributions. Timestamped correspondence outlining concerns I had raised calmly, repeatedly. Line by line, month by month, a different story emerged. Not one of abandonment, one of endurance, not one of impulsive departure, one of the documented attempts. There were emails where I had written, I don't feel heard. We need to rebalance responsibilities. I am asking for partnership, not rescue. There were responses where he minimized, deferred, reframed, and then there were the financial statements. Indisputable records of shared burden. The payments I had made quietly, adjustments I had absorbed, responsibilities I had carried without advertisement. I sat back in my chair and felt something settle inside me. It wasn't anger. It was certain. For months, perhaps years, I had wondered if I was misremembering, if I had been too sensitive, if perhaps I had indeed pulled away. But documents don't validate feelings. They validate chronology, and chronology told the truth. The narrative he was building externally depended on tone and assumption. Mine was anchored in timestamps. That night, I realized something critical. I didn't need to fight his version. I didn't need to compete with it socially. I only needed to ensure that when it mattered, legally, factually, permanently, the full record existed. The leverage wasn't explosive. It was structural. If he told the children I abandoned the family, there would one day be transcripts, statements under oath, court documents that reflected a sequence without emotion. And court transcripts do not adjust for pride. They do not put in the effort. They do not soften contradictions. I didn't celebrate this realization. There was nothing joyful about it. It meant the marriage, as I had hoped it might be repaired, was beyond restoration. It meant clarity had replaced illusion permanently. But it also meant I was no longer vulnerable to narrative erasure. For years, I had been underestimated because I did not interrupt. Now I understand the power of waiting. When the separation became formal, I cooperated fully, calmly. I did not dramatize. I did not provoke, because I knew something he didn't. He was still speaking in conversations. I was preparing for transcripts, and when the moment came, when stories would solidify into record, tone would no longer matter, only words. And the words, preserved exactly as spoken, would not favor invention. They would favor truth. Quietly, I closed the final folder that night with steady hands. No triumph, just clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't raise its voice. It simply waits for the right page to be read. There's always a moment before something becomes irreversible. Not when papers are signed, not when boxes are packed. But earlier, when you realize the version of events unfolding around you will harden unless you intervene. For me, that moment came 2 years after the separation. The divorce had been finalized quietly. No spectacle, no dramatic courtroom exchanges, just structured negotiations, documented agreements, and statements entered into record with professional composure. We had settled custody, divided assets, established responsibilities. On paper, everything was balanced. In conversation, it was not. The children were older now, perceptive enough to sense tension, young enough to accept simplified explanations. I had chosen, deliberately, not to correct him when he implied I had needed to leave, or that I had decided the marriage wasn't enough. I told myself they were too young for nuance. But one evening, our son came home unusually withdrawn. He lingered near the doorway of the kitchen while I was preparing dinner. "Did you leave because you were unhappy with us?" he asked. Not accusatory, just careful. The question didn't shatter me. It clarified something. "Noah," I said gently, "I left because certain things weren't healthy. It had nothing to do with you." He nodded slowly, but the hesitation in his eyes remained. Later that week, our daughter asked something similar. Framed differently, but rooted in the same assumption. "Dad said you just couldn't handle it anymore." Handle it. The language was familiar, and suddenly I understood the cost of continued silence. My restraint had protected dignity. It had prevented conflict. It had kept the divorce civilized. But it had also allowed a simplified narrative to settle into my children's understanding. Lucinda left. Lucinda couldn't handle it. Lucinda pulled away. I had 3 options. The first, confront him directly and demand that he stop framing it that way. Risk escalation, risk emotional crossfire. The second, sit the children down and offer my own verbal version, a counter-narrative shaped by feeling and memory. The third, wait until they were old enough to read. Not my interpretation, not his. The record. I went back to the transcripts that night, the official documentation of proceedings, sworn statements, direct answers to direct questions, descriptions of financial contributions, documented timelines of counseling requests, clarifications entered under oath. No embellishment, no raised voices, no dramatic flourishes, just language preserved exactly as spoken. And in that language, the sequence was undeniable. Requests for partnership, attempts at reconciliation, documented imbalance, formal acknowledgement of strain. Not abandonment, process. I closed the file and understood the irreversible choice before me. If I gave them my version too early, it would sound defensive. If I confronted him publicly, it would become a conflict story. But if I waited, if I trusted that truth, once read directly, carries its own weight, then clarity would not depend on my tone. It would depend on the text. Waiting meant tolerating a temporary misunderstanding. It meant accepting that for a time my children might quietly believe I had walked away. That was the hardest part. But I also knew something from years of documentation. Truth matures well. It does not decay under scrutiny. So I chose the irreversible path. I decided that when they were ready, truly ready, I would not argue. I would not dramatize. I would place the transcript in their hands and say, "Read," and then I would let the words, unfiltered, unedited, speak for themselves. There are moments in life when strength is not about immediate correction. It is about timing, and that night I committed to mine. Once that decision was made, there was no going back to partial explanations. I would wait, and when the moment came, I would not raise my voice. I would open a document, because the truth, when read directly, does not need defense. It only needs space. Once I chose to wait, my actions became even quieter. From the outside, nothing changed. I continued co-parenting with consistency. School events were attended without tension. Holidays were divided according to agreement. Birthdays were planned collaboratively, at least on the surface. He remained cordial in public, attentive in front of others. If anyone asked how we were managing, he would smile and say, "We're doing our best." It wasn't what I wanted, but Lucinda needed something different. It was elegantly phrased, subtle enough to avoid accusation, firm enough to imply instability. I didn't correct it. Instead, I ensured every exchange was documented, not obsessively, not coldly, just carefully. If plans changed, I confirmed them in writing. If financial adjustments were requested, I responded through traceable channels. If discussions about the children's schooling arose, I summarized agreements afterward. Just to keep everything clear, I would write. Clarity became my shield. At the same time, I strengthened my independence. I increased my hours at the legal office. Gradually, deliberately, I pursued certification modules that expanded my qualifications. I positioned myself not just as an administrator, but as someone capable of managing complex procedural workflows. Financial autonomy matters not as rebellion but as stability. I adjusted my budget without drama. I reduced discretionary expenses quietly. I built a modest reserve. I reviewed long-term projections for education costs and housing adjustments. No one saw the spreadsheets but me, and that was enough. He continued telling a softened version of events to mutual acquaintances. Nothing defamatory, nothing explosive, just a consistent undercurrent. That I had chosen distance, that he had been surprised, that he had carried more than I could manage. He believed, I think, that time would solidify that perception, that children hearing something often enough would absorb it without question. But children grow, and growth changes perspective. I never spoke negatively about him, not once. When the children relayed something he had said, I listened calmly. I answered only what was necessary. Your father and I saw things differently. Sometimes adults make decisions that are complicated. It wasn't about you. I refused to compete for narrative dominance. Instead, I prepared for narrative permanence. During this period, I requested certified copies of the final court transcripts, not because I anticipated immediate use, but because records can become harder to retrieve over time. When the envelope arrived, I placed it inside my navy leather document folder, the same one I had carried for years. There's something symbolic about holding official language in your hands. The pages were plain, black text on white paper, no drama in their presentation, but within them was a sequence, and sequence defeats distortion. He didn't know I had them, not because I hid them, but because he never considered I would need them. He believed the story lived in conversation. I understood it lived in a record. As the children approached adolescence, their questions became more layered, less innocent, more analytical. They noticed inconsistencies in tone. They compared accounts subconsciously. They began forming their own interpretations. And I remained steady, because moving in silence is not about secrecy. It's about patience. Every calm response I gave, every documented exchange, every financial adjustment made without complaint, all of it was groundwork. Not for confrontation, for clarity. The moment would come. Not explosive, not theatrical, just inevitable. And when it did, I would not argue about memory. I would present the text, because text does not tremble. It simply exists. The consequences didn't arrive like a storm. They arrived in silence. It began subtly. Our son stopped repeating certain phrases. Our daughter asked fewer leading questions about why I had needed to leave. There was a shift in their tone, less assumption, more observation. They were older now, old enough to sense that simplified explanations rarely hold under pressure. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between them in the sitting room. He always says she left, my daughter murmured. Yeah, our son replied, quieter, but he never explains why. That question, why, had started to linger in the house. He must have felt it too, because his language changed slightly. It became more detailed, more defensive in its softness. I tried, he would say. I wanted to keep us together. I was blindsided. The word suggested suddenness, impulsivity, an unpredictable decision. But adolescence sharpens perception. Children begin noticing timelines. They remember arguments they once ignored. They recall tensions they couldn't name at the time. One evening, after a family event, our son asked him directly, "Did Mom ever ask to fix things before she left?" I wasn't there for the conversation, but I felt its aftermath. He called me later than usual to confirm a routine schedule adjustment. His tone was tighter, controlled, but thinner. "They're asking questions," he said. "They're growing up," I replied calmly. There was a pause. "You've been talking to them," he suggested carefully. "No," I said, "I haven't." And that was true. I had not offered a narrative. I had offered stability. What he was beginning to feel wasn't confrontation. It was erosion. Because when a story depends on repetition rather than structure, it weakens under inquiry. The children began comparing details casually. "You said you were overwhelmed," our daughter mentioned once. "But Mom never seems overwhelmed." He laughed it off. "She doesn't show it." But doubt had entered the room. Not explosive doubt, not an accusation. Just curiosity. And curiosity is powerful. The consequences extended beyond the children. Mutual acquaintances who had quietly accepted the simplified version began noticing inconsistencies. When he framed himself as solely burdened, someone mentioned seeing me at the office regularly. When he implied financial imbalance, someone referenced my increased professional responsibilities. Nothing accusatory, just facts surfacing organically. He started compensating by speaking more carefully in public. Shorter explanations, fewer details. Confidence retracts when it senses instability. At home, the children's relationship with me shifted subtly. There was a new attentiveness in their questions, less assumption that I had pulled away, more awareness of complexity. One evening, our son lingered in the kitchen again, just as he had years earlier. "Did you try to stay?" he asked quietly. I looked at him steady. "Yes," I said, "I did." He held my gaze longer than usual, searching, and I knew the moment was approaching. Not yet, but soon. The consequence of narrative distortion is an immediate backlash. It's a delayed scrutiny, and scrutiny doesn't shout. It examines. He was beginning to feel that examination. Not from me, but from the natural maturation of our children's understanding. For years, he had relied on tone, on repetition, on the comfort of a simplified version. Now, questions were forming without my intervention. And questions once formed don't disappear. They seek documentation. He didn't know yet that documentation existed beyond conversation, but he sensed something slipping. Not control. Certainty. And certainty, once cracked, makes every statement feel less stable. I didn't accelerate it. I didn't hint at what I had. I continued co-parenting, continued responding calmly, continued documenting everything as before, because when the time came, it would not be fueled by accusation. It would be fueled by readiness, and readiness had been building quietly for years. The consequences had begun. Not loud, not public, but undeniable. The shift became unmistakable the year our son turned 16. At 16, children stop absorbing narratives and start interrogating them. He had a school assignment that required him to analyze bias in storytelling, how perspective alters truth. I remember him sitting at the dining table, flipping through articles, highlighting phrases, muttering about framing and omission. "It's interesting," he said casually, not looking up, "how two people can describe the same thing completely differently." I felt the quiet weight of that statement. "Yes," I replied, "perspective shapes emphasis." He looked at me then, not as a child seeking reassurance, but as a young man evaluating context. Later that week, he asked his father more pointed questions. I didn't hear the full conversation, but I heard Ray's volume for the first time in years. Not shouting, just frustration bleeding through composure. "You always say she left," our son pressed. "But what happened before that?" There's a difference between being asked for a summary and being asked for a sequence. Sequence requires specifics. Specifics require consistency. And consistency is fragile when built on softened phrasing. That evening, my phone buzzed. He wanted to clear the air. We met at a neutral cafe near the seafront, the same place we used to take the children for ice cream on warm evenings. He looked tired. "They're starting to question things," he said, keeping his voice low. "We need to present a united version." A united version. The phrasing was careful. "I've always presented stability," I replied. "That's not what I mean," he said quickly. "They're asking for details. We don't need to drag up old complications." Complications. There was something almost pleading in his tone now, a contrast to the earlier confidence. "I haven't dragged anything up," I said calmly. He exhaled sharply. "They're looking at me differently." There it was. Not concern for confusion. Concern for perception. "They're growing up," I said again. He leaned back, studying me. "You've told them something." "No," I answered. "I haven't." He searched my face for defensiveness, for guilt, for a crack. There was none, because I had not spoken. Silence, once strategic, had matured into inevitability. He tried a different approach. "Lucinda, whatever happened between us, it's done. There's no point dissecting it." Dissecting, as if analysis were unnecessary, as if clarity were indulgent. "I agree," I said. "There's no point in dissecting it." He seemed relieved for half a second, until I added, "Unless they ask." His jaw tightened. "They don't need transcripts," he said abruptly. Too abruptly. I hadn't mentioned transcripts. The word had surfaced from his own anxiety. That was the moment I knew. He understood that official records existed. He understood that sworn statements carry weight beyond conversation. And he understood that those statements could not be reframed with tone. "You're not going to he began, then stopped. I held his gaze. "I'm not going to do anything," I said evenly, "unless they're ready." Ready. That word unsettled him more than an accusation would have, because readiness implies time, growth, inevitability. You can debate emotion. You cannot debate documentation. He left that cafe quieter than I had ever seen him. In the following weeks, he attempted to soften his narrative further. Fewer references to abandonment, more generalized phrases about differences. But the foundation had already been questioned, and once children sense omission, they become determined to fill it. It was too late to recalibrate the story gently, too late to adjust tone, too late to reverse years of simplified phrasing, because now they weren't asking from confusion. They were asking for analysis, and analysis demands evidence. He had spent years building a version that felt comfortable. I had spent years preserving the record that felt accurate. When the collision came, it would not be explosive. It would be final, and I think he knew that. You can repair miscommunication early, but once doubt matures into investigation, revision no longer works. Only truth does. And truth, once documented, cannot be edited retroactively. It can only be read. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't involve shouting. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in my sitting room. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. The kettle hummed in the kitchen. Ordinary sounds, almost gentle. Our son asked first. "Mom," he said carefully, "can we see what actually happened? Not your side, not Dad's side. What actually happened?" Our daughter sat beside him, silent but steady. I studied their faces. Not children anymore. Not fully adults, but ready. "Are you sure?" I asked. They nodded. I walked to the hallway cupboard and retrieved the navy leather document folder, the same one I had carried for years. The one that had grown heavier, not in weight, but in meaning. I placed it on the coffee table. No dramatic speech, no warning. "These are the official transcripts from the court proceedings," I said calmly. Everything said under oath, nothing edited. I did not sit beside them. I gave them space. Pages turned slowly at first, then more deliberately. There were long stretches of silence, broken only by paper shifting and the occasional inhale of breath, when a timeline aligned differently than they had expected. They read my requests for counseling. They read documented financial contributions. They read exchanges where I asked for balance. They read his acknowledgments, recorded clearly, without tone to soften them. At one point, our daughter paused. "He said that?" she whispered. "Yes," I replied simply. No embellishment, no commentary, just confirmation. Our son read longer than she did, methodical, focused. His jaw tightened once, but not toward me. When they finished, they didn't look angry. They looked recalibrated. "Why didn't you show us this before?" our son asked. "Because you weren't ready," I said. "And because I didn't want to compete with conversation. I wanted you to understand it for yourselves. There's something powerful about allowing someone to reach their own conclusion. They didn't need me to interpret the text. The sequence spoke. Requests, delays, acknowledgments, outcomes. Not abandonment. Process." Later that evening, their father called. I could hear tension in his voice even before he spoke. "They asked me about the transcripts," he said. "Yes," I replied. "You showed them," they asked. There was a long pause. "You could have talked to me first." "I didn't need to," I said calmly. "The transcripts already exist." He exhaled sharply, not in anger but in realization. There was nothing to argue about, no misquote to challenge, no exaggeration to correct, no emotional outburst to dismiss. The words were his, recorded, preserved. "I didn't think you would," he began, then stopped. "You didn't think I kept them?" I finished gently. Silence. The confrontation ended not with escalation, but with absence. Absence of defense, absence of revision, absence of control. He couldn't argue with the court record, and he couldn't accuse me of distorting it. I hadn't added commentary. I had simply opened a folder. That evening, the house felt different. Not tense. Clear. The children moved around me with a new steadiness. Not protective, not resentful, just aware. Awareness changes relationships quietly. There was no victory in it, just a correction. And correction, when it comes from documentation rather than emotion, lands without noise. He had told them I abandoned the family. I let them read the court transcript, and the truth hit harder than any story he invented. Not because I raised my voice, but because I didn't. The most surprising part of all of this wasn't the confrontation. It was what followed. There was no dramatic fallout, no explosive reckoning, no emotional apologies delivered at my doorstep. There was simply a recalibration. The children didn't treat me like a hero. They didn't treat him like a villain. They treated both of us like human beings who had made complicated decisions inside a strained marriage. That was all I ever wanted. Not vindication, accuracy. In the weeks after they read the transcripts, something subtle shifted in our home. Our son began asking me about my work with genuine curiosity, not as an afterthought, but as substance. "What kind of cases do you manage? How do court records actually work? What happens if someone lies under oath?" These weren't random questions. They were questions born from seeing me differently. Our daughter started noticing patterns too, in conversations, in how stories are framed. She became more analytical, less accepting of simplified explanations. Neither of them confronted their father aggressively. That wasn't their nature. But they no longer absorbed his phrasing unquestioningly. And that was enough. As for him, his tone changed. Not dramatically, not publicly, just be more careful. He no longer said I left. He said we reached a point. He no longer implied fragility. He referenced complexity. It wasn't an apology. It was an adjustment. An adjustment is a form of acknowledgement. What changed most, however, was me. For years, I believed strength meant endurance, staying calm, absorbing misrepresentation without retaliation. I still believe in composure, but now I understand something deeper. Strength is not silence alone. It is silence paired with preparation. I don't feel bitter when I look back. I don't replay conversations wishing I had shouted louder. I don't resent the years I spent being underestimated. Those years sharpened me. They taught me that narratives are fragile when built on tone, that documentation outlasts charisma, that patience, when guided by clarity, becomes authority. I am no longer the woman described as sweet for trying. I am precise. I am deliberate. I am someone who understands that truth does not require theatrics. It requires preservation. Today I still carry that navy leather folder, though it sits mostly untouched now. Not because I expect to use it again, but because it represents something, not evidence of conflict, evidence of self-respect. I co-parent with steadiness. I work with intention. I speak when necessary, and remain quiet when silence serves better. And perhaps the most powerful transformation of all is this. I no longer need to be perceived correctly to feel secure. The record exists. The children understand. The narrative has aligned with reality, and I didn't have to raise my voice to make it happen. That to me is quiet dominance, not control over others, control over my response. And once you master that, no one can write your story without your consent again. If there is one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. Not every lie needs to be confronted immediately. Not every misrepresentation requires a raised voice. And not every injustice is corrected through confrontation. Sometimes the strongest response is restraint paired with preparation. When he told our children I abandoned the family, I could have reacted in 100 emotional ways. I could have defended myself loudly. I could have tried to dismantle his narrative piece by piece in real time. But real-time arguments depend on memory, on tone, on persuasion. Documentation depends on none of those things. The truth hit harder than any story he invented. Not because I attacked him, but because I allowed reality to stand on its own. There is something profoundly powerful about letting people arrive at clarity themselves. When you argue, people defend. When you explain too soon, they resist. But when they read, when they see a sequence without commentary, they understand. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't humiliation. It wasn't about winning. It was about ensuring that my children's understanding of their mother was rooted in fact, not framing. And here's what I learned. If you are being underestimated, do not rush to correct it emotionally. If you are being simplified, do not exhaust yourself proving complexity. If your story is being reshaped, preserve the record. Calm is not weakness. Patience is not passivity. Silence, when chosen deliberately, is a strategy. There is a difference between shrinking and waiting. I was not shrinking. I was waiting for the moment when truth would carry more weight than argument. And when that moment came, I didn't shout. I opened a folder. So now I want to ask you something, not as a storyteller, but as a woman who learned this the long way. Have you ever been quietly misrepresented and chosen patience over confrontation? If you have, what did waiting teach you? I would love to read your experiences in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.